Hi, my name is Jocelyn Aqua. I'm a privacy partner at PwC. I'm here with a panel to talk and answer questions that we've received about the California Consumer Privacy Act, the CCPA. Why don't you introduce yourselves?
Sure. Justin Antoni Pillay. I'm the founder and CEO of Wirewheel, and really excited to be here as part of this series we've been doing with Alistair, John, and you, Jocelyn.
I'm Alistair McTaggart. I'm the chair of Californians for Consumer Privacy.
So then I'm John Ackerley, co-founder and CEO of Virtue Corporation, and then also very happy to then be here today.
One of the questions that we're getting a lot are from small or medium-sized businesses, and they're asking, how does this really apply to them? Was this really written for those big companies, and what should their responsibilities be? Alistair, can you just let us know what your thoughts were when you wrote this?
Great. And one thing I do want to say at the outset, and I said this last time, but I think it's important in case someone's seen this for the first time, I don't have any financial relationship with either Wirewheel or Virtue or PwC. I've encountered you all in my travels and have been really glad to do so because you're all really dedicated privacy professionals, and all of you have dedicated your working lives to increasing privacy. So I'm happy to be here to help explain the law in this format. So in terms of the threshold, we did want to make sure that it wasn't going to affect startups, small mom and pops, your local dry cleaner. And so we have a $25 million threshold of annual revenue, or companies that retain and sort of use more than 50,000 people's records a year in order to market to them and sort of be really truly data brokers, or companies that get more than 50% of their revenue from selling personal information every year.
Yeah, Alistair, so a good example of the questions we got in the last webinar, which was really interesting. So say you're a small SaaS provider and you get 50,000 records from a company that collected them in California, you're covered, right?
Mm-hmm.
Basically?
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you're probably covered not only as a matter of the CCPA, but this is the way the market is moving, don't you think?
It's a great point. Justin, people all so first of all, yes, if it's 50,000 Californians, remember we just covered California consumers. And as a California right, so we don't regulate businesses around the world. We just regulate businesses that do business in California. And then, yeah, I feel like this is the way the world is moving right now, that privacy is, you look at Europe, now 1 in 8 Americans is covered by this law. This is, 5 or 7 years ago, this wasn't really something people were thinking about. Now, everywhere you turn, there's another news story about it, and this is an idea whose time has come.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the great things about having this discussion now is that the enforcement doesn't really start until the 2020. So then, unlike what happened back in 2018 around the GDPR. It is great to see that people are getting out in front of this topic, and frankly, doing the right thing from a data privacy perspective also really helps from a data security perspective. Knowing where your data is and then protecting that is just foundational.
And I would add that if you are a small business working with a larger business, that business is going to want, as they share data with you, that you live up to your expectations in order for them to be able to do business. So as you start to grow and think through these issues and build your company with privacy in mind, security in mind, it's going to be the way that you actually are able to do business with other companies. Alistair, I have one more question for you directed based on our conversations. And it is there's some confusion about what is the sale of data means. Is it also sharing data for monetary value? Is it sharing, can you maybe go through a little bit about it?
So we have a broad definition of sell, which is sort of exchange for share for valuable consideration. What we do, though, is we have a whole subset of things that the consumer cannot opt out of, and that is a list of business purposes, because we wanted to make sure that business could keep on functioning. And a good way to think about that is, let's say you go to a retailer and you opt out of the sale of your information, and then the next day you want to buy something from the retailer. The first thing they're going to do is send your credit card information to a fraud detection outfit, and they're going to get back a code saying, yes, you can sell. Well, actually, your personal financial data has left the retailer's walls, gone to this other company, and there's been money exchanged on both sides. The retailer sold you something. In effect, the retailer has sold your information. But you want them to because you want to buy the thing. You just don't want them to sell it to the data broker. And so the question is, how do you achieve that? And the way we achieved it, and I'm very pleased with, we have this list of things you can't opt out of. And A really important part of that is, for example, we know that advertising drives the internet. We didn't want to break the engine of the internet. So we allow for advertising and marketing as one of those business purposes. You, the consumer, can't opt out of it. That said, we prevent the secondary use of it. So once the ad network or the client, the advertising client, has your information and knows you're interested in that car, they can't then resell it. And that's what's happening right now. It's all getting resold. But the actual the information that the first party has on you can be used to market to you.
So then, Justin, how do you help companies try and implement that difference?
So, I mean, what Alistair is basically covering, and it's a really important point, is that even when you opt out of the sale of the data, the company that you're doing business with can advertise to you. That's a critical thing, don't you think, Alistair, that I think is really under-recognized. From a technical perspective and an implementation perspective, that means companies need to be thinking about preference management now. You have to think about how your customers are interacting with you and how are they actually going to give you that signal that they want to opt out of the sale of the information. So these preference portals that you're seeing come up all over for products are going to be more and more important. And I think that's being driven a lot by California. You have to give a nice, clear option that enables the opt-out of the sale of the data. You're going to want to give clear disclosure about what that means, that you'll still be able to do other things with the data, including advertising. Otherwise, even if it's part of the law, it's not really truly understandable to people that if you've opted out of the sale, you still might get that first-party advertising or that the data is going to be transferred for protecting your data. These are really important bits of information that you start putting in front of your customers in really understandable ways. There is also a point on, I'm sure we're going to come to this, on recognizing third-party opt-out, which I think is a good topic for us to get to here. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, please, go ahead.
Well, just on the third party, I think one of the central parts of our law that I think will make it easy for consumers to kind of understand is we put in the law that businesses have to honor a third-party opt-out request. And so what that means is, think of it this way, and I've already talked to browser companies who have said that they would do this. They'll put an extension in the browser, which would send the signal every time you get to any website not to sell the consumer's information. The websites will have to take that signal. That way the consumer doesn't have to sit around saying, did I click on this? Did I click on that? And bear in mind, we've been teaching people to clear their cookies. So then the company can't recognize who you are so that it will, again, be able to sell your information if it can't recognize who you are. So you have to have some kind of system where I think to make this thing operational, where the browser will kind of sweep up behind you as you go travel the web and just say, do not sell this person's information.
So then that is a very well said, and I think to kind of tie it together, your point about not breaking the internet by allowing advertising, plus giving real teeth and real consumer control behind opting out is just such a win-win for society. And I'm not sure, whether people already en masse have gotten fatigue from all of the notices that have come out of a more European approach here, but I really am excited about these new controls in the browser. So then automatic opt-out is just one example of that. But I just love what you're doing from that perspective.
Well, thanks. And I'm not here to, criticize GDPR, but one of the things I like about our law is I do think sometimes when I've been on the European sites and you have to keep on clicking, after a while you stop reading them. Actually, you never read them, and so you just click, get it out of my way. I want to read the article. From our point of view, is I didn't ever want to have to read another privacy policy. So we drew the line saying, you get to the website, you can have that one option, don't sell your information. Because I think it's a kind of an American approach to give people choice and some responsibility too. If I'm dealing with Uber, I kind of have to know they're going to collect my credit card information. They know where I sleep. They know where I work. I'm okay with that. It feels different than if they're taking information, and I'm not saying they are, but if I'm taking information and selling it somewhere, that feels differently.
And if you don't mind me just going one turn on, if you're a company then and you're trying to implement this, you're trying to get ready for CCPA, there are two things that you need to do. One, you need to give a clear place that's understandable that enables the opt-out directly. The second thing is you have to be prepared to take a third-party signal that effectuates that same thing, even if it's not directly. That interim piece, we're obviously tackling ourselves, creating these kinds of implementing portals that any company can launch quickly. That interim step where you're able to take that third-party signal, we're going to have some standards around that because you need single ways that that's done. And I think that'll be part of where the tech community can come together, develop some standards so that small and medium-sized companies know which particular signal to get together and how. You know
so
what
then
I mean?
can you give some examples of those signals just so that everyone fully understands what you're talking about?
Yeah, sure, John. I mean, so for example, exposing an API or a standard set of definitions that a third-party sender could send back. If a customer, for example, goes to third-party providers, and I think my guess is, Alistair, this is part of the point behind the law, that you could go to a third party and say, I'm opting always out of the sale of my data. You want that signal to be able to spread, and you want third-party services or vendors or companies to be able to get that signal without the customer having to tell you every single time. I think APIs are going to really enable that in a whole bunch of ways, but there's a number of other ways that we can take that signal going forward. But standards are going to be important here.
A couple of comments about that. One standard might be the unsubscribe button. We all kind of know what that looks like, right? So you be somewhat similar to that. And then I think there's an important competitive aspect to having the third-party opt-out. Unless you have the third-party opt-out, you, the consumer, are more likely to opt out of the sites you visit a lot. So that maybe the larger sites get opted out of, but the one you visit once in a month, you don't opt out of. And there's an asymmetry there. So I think that it's important to be able to effectuate this third-party opting out. And it's one of the things I'm really pleased is in the law.
So in addition to this opt-out right, there are a lot of other individual rights that you made clear that were important to U.S. consumers. One of which is this ability to get access to their data and to be able to seek deletion. Would you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll start, but I always like to talk also about what the purpose of the act, both under European law, and you can see that moving across the world right now. GDPR is really moving country to country as a standard. I think the CCPA is coming into that conversation too, but in the absence of a big federal law, I think GDPR is probably moving more quickly. But it's fundamentally the right to first of all, understand what data was collected about you, but then get access to it one way or another. And there's some important rights in CCPA around that. Alistair, do you want to talk about what your intent was around that? And then John and I can talk about some of the technical challenges that companies face in actually fulfilling that.
I think for me, this was just one of the foundational parts of the law. It struck me when I first got involved, it was strange that I could go to the government in many respects and get a Freedom of Information Act and find out what the government knew about me, but I couldn't do that with companies. And so that's all we're trying to do here is say to people, and I think people increasingly want to know what companies know about them. And I think there's going to be a bit of a sunshine, disinfectant thing here. If you're a company and you're just collecting everything about a consumer and you don't really need it, but you are just because you can, maybe you'll stop. Maybe you would think, okay, I'm a retailer. I don't really need to know whether, what the person's sexual orientation is. I don't really need to know, what I think their religion is. And so I do think there's some data cleanliness that'll come from all this. And anyway, that's a pretty important right for me.
I have to agree with that. I think as companies are starting to look through, and in order to be able to meet that January 2020 requirement of a look back, looking through the data that they're actually collecting and making those decisions at this point, is this something that I really need? And how long do I really want to keep it? Because how much information is it really needed for my business? And then how long do I keep it? And what will I need to share with customers about what I've been collecting?
Yeah, it is sort of like at the Ackerley household where my wife is decluttering and has about 4 books about how we need to go do that. It's just good hygiene generally to take a look at what data you have. And there's just, a lot of that work, frankly, has been happening over the past couple of years through the GDPR, for example. And so I think, one of the great things about where we are today is that through tools like a wire wheel, this is not a heavy lift anymore. This is just a must do.
Yeah, and John, so you're running a security company. Companies that are then implementing, right? You have to go then collect the information, get it back to your customer. There's some really practical challenges, right, in going to do that. Small, medium, large companies are having to face. So just thinking about it for how you, from a security perspective,
yes,
if you're going to help your customers get their own data, what do companies need to think about?
Yeah, that's a great point. And it is something we saw So then a lot in the intelligence community, and also frankly with our first product around email, is that data multiplies, data moves everywhere. And as more and more requests happen, if you don't think about how you protect and secure those workflows in a really easy way, you could actually be exacerbating the problem. So if a consumer is asking for what data they have, that should probably be end-to-end encrypted, and there are ways to then do that in a very easy way. What you don't want to do is have a well-intended so then law actually really create even more problems. And so, that is, I think, pretty foundational to kind of think through that full workflow all the way to the end consumer.
And that just brings up one thing, Jocelyn, if it's okay to talk about. One of the things that we gave the AG the responsibility and authority to do was to develop certain standards around certain things. And one of the most important is what's a verified request, a verified consumer request. And to what John just said, our desire is obviously not that this creates more problems. And so the AG is in California is considering input and to publish rules. One of our suggestions is, look, the company really should be able to determine who you are, because you certainly don't want to create a fraud possibility. And so that threshold should be much higher than an opt-out request. Opt-out request, if I opt out and pretend to be Justin, he's not harmed. If I pretend to be Justin and get his information, he's certainly
Access
harmed.
to his data.
So we have different thresholds for those. Our suggestion is that they have different thresholds for that, and that they make it very secure. And so, one of the reasons also I'm here with both these fellows is because I think that they are developing market solutions to consumers' need for privacy. They're not the only two companies in the world. There are others, but you think about being able to deliver the information to the consumer in a encrypted way. It's what John's company does.
And when I think, just to build on that, so from a company that's trying to tackle and make solutions to fulfill this for companies to their own customers, John, I think what you said is really important. If you start with the idea that you're going to help get your customers' data out of the underlying databases, and you're going to manage that and clear it and get it to the customer using email just alone or some standard tools, you may be multiplying a privacy problem in your own company. You have to think very carefully about that and pick tools that actually aren't multiplying or spreading your customer information around your own enterprise and outside. I think what you brought up about encryption, end-to-end encryption, is an important feature where, as a tool, the idea that you're not actually enabling even the processors to get access to the customer's data is a huge value proposition. And Alistair, there's a piece in the law that gets a fair amount of questions that's around the ability to make a subject access request tied to a device. So effectively, a device ID can generate a subject access request. Could you talk a little bit about what the goal was and why you did that? And I could talk a little bit about some of the technical challenges around that.
So I think this is one, again, where we gave the Attorney General a lot of leeway because, again, one of my contentions, one of the reasons I pulled the initiative in favor of doing a law was because this is a fast-moving area. The legislature is much more able to quickly change the law. If you're familiar with the initiative, you can only change it with another initiative. And so increasingly our devices are us. We are our devices. And so it was very important to me to not simply say your name and your email is your personal information, nothing else is, right? Because my phone knows everything about me. And so, but at the same time, we can't be in a situation where I can just show up my phone and say, what do you know about it? Because I can be the stalker and I can get a hold of my, ex-wife's phone and grab all the data off that. That's not a good outcome either. And there are public safety issues around that. So what we're saying is, yes, you should be able to treat your device like you, but there's going to be a high bar to prove that it's your device so that the company doesn't have any problem sharing the information it knows about that device. But at the end of the day, the intention is that the consumer can access what the company knows about the device to prevent a situation where a business would say, oh, I know nothing about you, but boy, I know a lot about your phone.
It's a really important point.
So companies right now there are a bunch of companies that had to implement GDPR. And so they've been dealing with access and deletion requests for a little bit, and they're trying to understand what is the difference between what you needed to do for GDPR, what you need to do in terms of an access and deletion request, and what kind of information is a company required to disclose. There's a lot of discussion in the statute, a lot of it talks about categories of information or specific pieces of information. And so wanted some clarity. A lot of companies are asking for that type of description and what they're supposed to do.
So if I could jump in for a moment, I think on the particular so California is a little different than GDPR on this one issue, where GDPR is focused on the individual. California actually comes up with this concept of model to the device, and there's some good rational reasons for it, if I understand. Among other things, the marketing world is actually modeling human beings often tied to a device, even if their name is not attached to it. And so there's some really good, thoughtful reasoning, if I understand it, Alistair, behind this. From a practical perspective, my sense of where this is going to go is you have both authentication and then verification. And when you get into a device, I think there will probably be some sense of the burden on the person if you're just trying to get a request tied to a device, that you verify that you're actually the one whose data is on that device all by yourself. Because if you have, we all know, we all have at our homes shared computers, phones that are sometimes shared. Think about a car. A car is a shared device that has a lot of personal information about you. And I think when you're getting to making the point of actually verifying that I'm the one whose data is the only one on there and you're not leaking data from one person to another, that's going to be an important concept that technically we can solve in a bunch of different ways. Authentication and verification are going to be two important types of concepts to bring to that. Don't you think?
I agree.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
And you asked a second question in there, Jocelyn, which I think we can all tackle, which is the questions around what do you actually have to tell people and under CCPA about what the data is you're collecting, like at what level of specificity? I think that's a good one for Alistair to tackle. Like from when you're thinking about it and you've seen the language, what level of specificity is actually in CCPA about what you have to disclose?
Yeah, and clearly, again, this is an area where we wanted to leave some leeway, and we have given a tremendous amount of leeway to the AG on purpose. And I've gotten some criticism for that, and I would push back on that always by saying it's better to have a law that can move with the times than a law that is stuck in time in 2019, because in 5 years, the whole technology will be different. So in terms of specific pieces of information, I think where I'm going to be, I'm just one voice here, but where I'm going to be pushing to get rules enacted on is information that is useful to the consumer. So, maybe not every single line of an audit log, every single line of sort of if your cell phone is moving around town, do you want every single time it pings a tower? At some point, maybe too much information becomes overload and not particularly useful to the consumer. But at the same time, if you're denied a mortgage, you kind of want to know why, and so there's a balance there, and I feel confident that we will get to a good place where a specific piece of information doesn't just mean we know about you, period,
right.
But also doesn't mean like every last line of code from every company.
So I think what's happening with some companies is that what they're realizing is that they have similar data, different versions from different companies that they have in their systems now, and trying to figure out that level of what they should be sharing. And part of this comes to then is, why do you have so many different versions and so many different pieces of information in different places, and trying to figure out like what you have about an individual and what you need to share as a result.
No, I agree with that. And I'd say as a practical matter, again, this brings up 2 or 3 questions for me. The first is, and this is an important piece of guidance and you raised this, Jocelyn, and Alistair, you cover this. Generally, CCPA requires you to post the categories of data as opposed to down to every data element. And that's important, right? You have to be able to fairly disclose by category, but not every single data element. And that's going to have to be developed. We want this to be fair, I assume, Alice.
Well, it's a user experience, so than optimization, actually, because if you just have a trove of data, 99.99% of consumers are going to be like, okay, that's kind of interesting, but too much. But if you can actually clearly articulate the categories, why it matters, and then linking back to real use cases like I was denied a mortgage, that really matters. And that's a big UX optimization, I think.
And just to be clear, you still always have the right to get your specific pieces of information. So that, but in terms of where it's gone, we're shared absolutely the categories, because that might, we wanted to try to strike the right balance between what's meaningful to the consumer and also, a concise ability for the companies to say what they're collecting and why.
Yeah, and as an implementation piece, there are a number of techniques we bring to actually help identify for a company. So say you're a growing company, a small, medium-sized company. How do you then tackle this? And there are ways that you can collect the categories or this information from people. When I sort of think about it as top down, how do you collect that efficiently, even if you're just collecting it from the team that built the product? Then there's ways that you can actually understand what personal information is being shared by looking at the API layer, right, technically. And that's where you sort of enable the applications to be plugged into one another. And there are ways you can actually model it straight out of the data stores that are driving your applications or your products. And all three of those techniques are actually available to companies, even small companies, if you know how to do it. And so there will be ways I think companies can tackle this, and a lot of ways that you can think about it technically.
I wanted to talk a little bit about, we're getting a lot of questions about what is entailed with this private right of action, and what was your thoughts behind putting that in the statute?
So yes, this has been a part that's very got a lot of attention from both the privacy-centric folks and the people who maybe were not initially receptive to the idea of any kind of privacy regulation. And so our private right of action, that's a fancy way of saying that consumers can sue the company as opposed to the attorney general suing the companies. Our private right of action is only with respect to data breaches, and then only with respect to sensitive information, so health information and financial information, essentially. And then here's a really important part, because we're not trying to catch anybody just for the sake of catching them. We're trying to incent good behavior. So there are 3 safe harbors where there is no private right of action, even if you have a data breach. And that is if you encrypted the data, if you redacted, that means taking the names out of the data, or if you had reasonable security procedures and practices in place to protect the data. And so as a business person, it was really important to me to say, look, I want a standard here that anybody who's reasonable can meet. And so we all know that encryption it's not like, we're not talking NSA anymore. This is off-the-shelf stuff. Actually, John's company does this. All big companies have it and should do it, and then some companies don't. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, hey, everybody, you need to encrypt your data. And the real sort of analog here is if you're a bank, we're just saying, hey, lock the door when you leave at night. It's that basic. And so I feel very comfortable that there really is no private right of action in this bill if companies act well. And it's entirely achievable.
So I think what's really interesting too, it's the first read is, oh my goodness, private right of action. Oh no. But in my conversations with the policymakers over the past couple of months, when you really get into it, it said, of course, this makes sense. And, it is very well scoped. And I think the carve-outs make a lot of sense. And frankly, not to do a big pitch for the big cloud privacy or the big cloud providers, but they also offer some of these capabilities out of the box as well. So, I feel like it is really foundational. And when you think about federal legislation here, I really think this has got to be maintained as the floor, because this is incenting like really foundationally important action on the part of every company.
So what's interesting right now is that we are focused on CCPA, but the same thing is happening in states all across the United States. A big question we're getting as bills are being introduced in Washington, in New York, in Virginia, what should companies do? Because they are focused on CCPA, but they have to think through all of these other pending legislations that are probably going to happen, at least a few of them in the next few months. So then, Justin, what is your advice for companies?
My main advice for companies is you should be doing kind of the same things regardless of the law. There'll be some edge cases around that we're going to have to smooth out, or there'll be a national piece of legislation. And either way, you're going to have to deal with it. Most major companies are thinking about it internationally anyway. So what are those critical things? You have to basically know, where are you storing and processing the information? You should at least know that when it comes to personal information. You should at least know what kind of personal data are you collecting and observing. And I'd always focused on that observing part, because a lot of the logging and other collection that might be more passive is sometimes hard to be on top of. And you should really focus on who are you sharing that data with and why. Know your partners, understand where it's going, at least have that basically mapped out. And finally, at least basic defensible security. Encryption is a really good thing to think about. That depends on what kind of data you have. If you've done those 5 things, then whether it's Washington with some of their edge cases and the way California is done, or GDPR, if you focused on those basic things, what are you collecting and observing, and is it the right thing? Where are you storing it and processing it? Who are you sharing it with and why? And have you basically taken care of your security environment? Like, simplify it. That's the way we do it at Wirewheel. You can really tackle these different statutes as they come up, and there are going to be some edge case requirements that you have to go to, but focus on the fundamentals. Make sure fundamentally you're doing the right thing, and you're going to be okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is very well said. And just to repeat from our first webinar, and I just love how simple this actually is, right? So then a CCPA is the right to know, it's the right to say no, and it's the right to then have your data be secured. And I think that is just really important for people to then keep in mind when oftentimes there is, even today, some then a fear mongering that this is complicated, this is going to stifle innovation. It's like, no way. This is foundational for security. Know where your data is, know with whom you are sharing with it, secure that end to end. I think this is a really exciting moment right now for our country.
And I don't know if you've had a chance to go through and do a deep dive in some of these other proposals, but they are very similar to CCPA. Some track CCPA, some track GDPR more.
And there's consensus
they all
coming
have
around.
The foundational core requirements.
So, Jocelyn, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to turn it back on you. So you're a real leader in this field. You led in the government for, I'm not going to say the number of years, but led in the government, now leading a practice, and working with companies. So let's go around quickly and say, do you think there'll be federal privacy legislation, let's say, in the next year?
I know how long it takes, and I know how many efforts there had been in a unified federal data breach notification law that never happened. I would say maybe not this year, but I do think that there'll be a push for it as all of these other states start coming into final, and yes. So
I'll
John?
be controversial. I will say that there will be, and it'll be really driven by, and it'll be principles based, and there'll be consensus around CCPA being the floor. If there's not, I think CCPA obviously becomes the de facto national standard.
So, Jocelyn, as you know, but our viewers might not, we're in Washington, D.C. right now, and I've spent the week here visiting folks on the Hill. And what I would say is I actually probably my chance that my bet on federal legislation would be under 50% this year. That said, I've had numerous conversations with numerous members, both sides of the aisle, especially from California, and I really have not had a member yet who says that they themselves would vote for or permit anything that was less stringent than California. And I've had California members flat out just say, we're not going to permit preemption. So again, what's that worth? I don't know. Everything, as we know, can happen in politics, and so it may. But I'm proceeding on the basis that California is going to be a strong voice in terms of this is the one law of all the state laws you're talking about that's actually law. And my final point would be, like, we all may clean the kitchen differently, but we know what a clean kitchen looks like. All these laws are the same, or variations on the same theme of a clean kitchen. They all want to give you consumers access to their information, control over it, and safety. And that's all we do. And we do it in one way, and other states may do it in other ways.
So, and if I had to say, I'll say I don't think it'll happen in the next year. I hope if something happens, it's meaningful. I mean, I think it's going to be important that it's meaningful. And the way I think about this is, in the absence of U.S. leadership or having an example that's out there, and again, I think CCPA is an important one, but having a federal law, right now, other laws are moving across the world. And there are some really important American values that I think we want to be on the table as privacy is being considered around the world. I'll give you one example. If if you talk to most Americans and you say, okay, let's say you really did know what was happening with your information, if it was clear and you understood it, I should get to sell or share it as I see fit. I should be able to do that. That's my choice. GDPR, for example, has the concept that even if you know and totally understand what's going on, there are times where the European Commission or the regulators can say, no, you can't sell or share it. That's a fundamentally different approach. I think Americans have a different approach to that when it comes to something that's fundamentally yours. And my view is those kinds of issues, First Amendment issues, are things that I would love to be part of the conversation all around the world as countries are considering privacy. So I really do hope we get something on the table soon, because there are some fundamental things that we want to be part of this discussion.
Yeah, that is very well said. And for those of you who, so then who do not know it, so then obviously Justin was at the forefront of Privacy Shield and also all the discussions around GDPR. And I guess just a question for you, beyond the Europeans, if the U.S. doesn't start taking a real leadership position on this topic, what is the risk more generally around the balkanization of the internet, and just how does the world look in 5 years potentially? What is the downside? I think for the U.S. privacy folks, maybe we're okay without it, but I mean, what is that scenario if we don't do something nationally?
I think you're exactly right. So a couple, the two quick things I'd say is, one, Europe on the digital front until recently has had 28 different e-commerce sets of rules. So if you were a small company and you wanted to really do business in Europe, the barrier to entry of figuring out how you had to do business electronically in 28 member states was a huge thing. I mean, I have a small company and others have small companies and we're growing. But if you had to tell me I had to go state to state and figure out the differences, it would really make it harder, sometimes disablingly so, to do that. So I think that's a good lesson for us to look at. Is that was in the e-commerce space. And I think there would be a real value to making sure we've at least thought about harmonizing in the U.S. in some ways. And I think we're kind of doing that, in many ways right now. And I think having one out there as a basic, stomping mark.
Yeah, I would say right now, from my experience, the CCPA is being treated as a federal law by most of our companies. There's very few companies that don't have a California footprint and don't have to apply it.
Yeah, and thanks, Jocelyn, because I would just push back a tiny little bit. I think the prospects of having to comply with 50 laws are dim in the following sense. Our law goes into effect in January. I think it's going to be unsustainable as a matter of just business reputation for companies to say, we're going to give 1 in 8 Americans this consumer privacy, but we're not going to give the other 7 out of 8 Americans, especially when Americans living in Texas or Kansas or New York know that it's simply a matter of just unchecking a box, and then all of a sudden those same rights would apply. So I think what will happen is this becomes a de facto national standard. Now, the feds could have a national legislation. Remember that the HIPAA legislation and GLBA, the health and the financial services, are both what they call floors, not ceilings. So they're national legislation around privacy, but they let the states go further. I think California's kind of short-circuited that and just said, here's our law, and it's going to become sort of the head of the arrow and just pull the rest of the country along, like California does with air resources and car manufacturing. And so the model's already there. We have California delegates in the city saying that they're not going to permit preemption. If it were me, I would be focusing on California as a business, saying like that's going to become the de facto standard.
Totally reasonable. So we're probably getting towards the end, as surprising as that is. Did you have I think we talked about one last thing that's coming up that I think may be worth covering just even briefly, Alistair. And obviously, I'm looking forward to the next session. There's been a lot of questions coming up from the last session. I'm sure they'll come out of this one. Retroactivity. So companies have collected a fair amount of personal information now. CCPA goes into effect. How do you think about what is covered when? What do you do with information that was already covered?
It's an important point. The law goes into effect in January, and the AG, by definition, hasn't promulgated rules yet. So let's wait to see what the rules say, because it's clearly not fair to have rules apply to something if you don't know what the rules are going to be, right? So you can't. So let's wait to see what the rules are. I think, look, for me, I was never about let's gotcha, let's try to catch somebody doing something bad. I think we want to have a framework that we put into place, the law, and I think is not especially important what exactual, day one, what's covered. I think it's getting the principles in place there. But again, this is I don't want to get out ahead of myself because it's not my rule. It's the AG's rule.
Awesome. It's
Very
funny
well
how that
said.
happens. Huh?
Right.
Now it's
Now it's not yours.
Well, it's the process.
I'll start one more question. There's been a fair amount of debate as to what a company needs to disclose with respect to its vendors, and then what does the company actually need to know about their vendors in terms of data going back and forth.
Sure, and I think it's a reasonable point because in the initiative we had one set of criteria, and now we have another. And so let's talk about categories. You need to know what kind of categories of personal information you're collecting, and you need to be able to disclose that. And then the categories of third parties with whom you've shared it, you need to know that. You don't need to disclose the specific third parties with whom it was shared. Now, as a business matter, because of the deletion request, you, the business, will need to know where you've sent the information so that you can respond to a deletion request. But that's the inner side that's not shared with the consumer.
Not with public. Well, thank you so much for speaking with us today, and we look forward to having our next in our series of discussions about the CCPA soon.
Awesome. Thanks so much for hosting.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.